Chapter 1. The dawn of a civilization. The Mediterranean at dawn was a spectacle that seemed eternal, the kind of beauty that poets and painters would later attempt to capture for centuries. The horizon glowed with molten gold as the sun rose over a sea whose surface shimmered like liquid glass. The salty breeze carried the scent of distant islands and the promise of trade, adventure, and war. From the rugged coasts and rocky peninsulas, the earliest Greek communities watched the sunrise with reverence, for they lived in a land where nature itself demanded both respect and resilience. This was no easy homeland. Mountains rose like stone fortresses, separating valleys and isolating communities. The sea was everywhere, a highway for merchants, pirates, and warriors alike, but also a constant reminder of nature's unpredictability. Life here required courage. Crops clung to the terraced hillsides. Goats and sheep grazed on slopes too steep for the plow. People had to rely on both their own cunning and the goodwill of the gods. Yet despite the harshness, or perhaps because of it, a unique spirit flourished. Across this fragmented landscape, Peleus city-states began to emerge. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, each was a world unto itself, fiercely independent, bound by local laws and traditions, yet united in their worship of the Olympian gods. There was no central king to rule them all. Unity came instead through shared myths, common festivals, and a language whose rhythm could carry both the commands of a general and the verses of a poet. At the heart of their belief system stood Mount Olympus, its snow-capped peaks disappearing into the clouds. It was said to be the home of the gods: Zeus, the ruler of the sky and keeper of justice; Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war strategy; Apollo, the bringer of light and music; and Poseidon, lord of the seas, whose moods could bless a voyage or doom an entire fleet. The Greeks saw their gods not as distant, perfect beings, but as powerful personalities who could be swayed by offerings, prayers, and honor. Gods who meddled in human affairs and often mirrored human flaws. Stories about these gods, and about the heroes who served them, were the lifeblood of Greek identity. The epics of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey were already being sung by bards who traveled from town to town. These were not mere tales for children. They were a moral compass, a historical record, and a celebration of the Greek ideal: courage, honor, cleverness, and an unyielding will to carve one's name into history. In Athens, then little more than a fortified hill and a scattering of homes, the seeds of democracy and culture were quietly being planted. The harbor at Piraeus bustled with fishermen, traders, and travelers from distant lands, bringing goods and ideas. There was already talk of philosophy, of questioning the nature of truth and justice. In Sparta, far to the south, an entirely different way of life was taking shape. Here, the state existed for one purpose: to create warriors without equal. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and trained in the agoge, a brutal system designed to harden the body, sharpen the mind, and erase all fear of death. Beyond these centers of power, other city-states thrived in their own ways. Corinth, strategically placed between the Aegean and Ionian seas, grew wealthy from trade. Delphi became the spiritual heart of Greece, where the oracle spoke cryptic prophecies in Apollo's name. Festivals like the Olympic Games began to unite the Greek world, offering a stage where athletes could prove their excellence and win immortal glory. But beneath this vibrancy lay tensions that would one day ignite into war. The independence that made each polis proud also made them rivals. Border disputes could escalate into bloodshed. Alliances were forged and broken with equal swiftness. Every city watched its neighbors warily, knowing that today's ally might be tomorrow's enemy. Still, in these early days, there was more light than shadow. Sculptors were beginning to master the human form, coaxing lifelike grace from cold marble. Shipbuilders designed faster vessels, capable of cutting through the Aegean with unmatched speed. Farmers experimented with new methods to make the rocky soil yield more grain, olives, and grapes. And in the minds of a few restless thinkers, questions began to take root. Questions about the nature of reality, the origins of the cosmos, and the meaning of a good life. The world beyond Greece was stirring as well. In the east, powerful empires rose and fell. Traders from Phoenicia brought their alphabet, a gift that would change Greek communication forever. Egypt's ancient wisdom traveled northward on merchant ships, mingling with local traditions. Greece was not yet the dominant power of the Mediterranean, but it was already at crossroads of cultures, absorbing influences even as it began to shape its own destiny. For now, the Greeks were still a people of small cities, bound together by sea routes and stories, by shared victories in the hunt and the harvest, by the ever-present gaze of their gods. But a spark had been lit, one that would grow into a flame bright enough to illuminate the ages. The ideals forming in these scattered communities, freedom, inquiry, excellence, and honor, would one day echo far beyond their shores. And so, as the sun climbed higher over the Aegean and cast its light on the stone walls of fledgling cities, the age of ancient Greece began in earnest. It was a beginning both humble and extraordinary, the dawn of a civilization whose brilliance would guide the world for millennia, even as its own passions and rivalries would one day lead it toward tragedy. Here, between mountain and sea, among farmers, warriors, traders, and poets, the stage was set for one of history's most remarkable stories, a tale of glory and shadows of human triumph and human folly, born in the cradle of the Mediterranean.
Before there were historians, there were storytellers. And before there was history, there were myths. The great tapestry of legend upon which the Greeks wove their identity. In this age, the lines between truth and imagination blurred, and the deeds of mortals could echo as loudly as the will of the gods. For the Greeks, myths were not just tales of the past. They were the spiritual and moral foundation of their world. Every child, whether born in a fisherman's hut on the island of Lesbos or in the marble halls of Corinth, grew up hearing the exploits of Heracles, the strongest of all mortals, who completed 12 impossible labors to atone for a tragic crime. His story was a lesson in perseverance, that even the mightiest could stumble, and redemption required both strength and suffering. They knew of Perseus, who dared to face the Gorgon Medusa, whose gaze could turn men to stone. Armed with the gifts of the gods, Hermes' winged sandals, Athena's polished shield, he triumphed not only through courage but through cunning. His tale taught that intelligence could be a weapon as sharp as any sword. And then there was Theseus, the prince of Athens, who sailed to Crete to face the Minotaur in the labyrinth of King Minos. With the help of Princess Ariadne's thread, he found his way through the maze and struck down the beast. To the Athenians, Theseus was more than a hero. He was the embodiment of their city's ideals: bravery, cleverness, and a will to defy tyranny. These heroes were not distant figures. Their presence was woven into everyday life. Statues of Heracles guarded city gates. Frescoes of Perseus hung in council chambers. Plays and festivals reenacted the labors, the voyages, and the battles, allowing each generation to step into the sandals of their ancestors. The myths also explained the world's mysteries. Why did the seasons change? The Greeks told of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and her daughter Persephone, who was taken to the underworld by Hades. In her grief, Demeter withheld her bounty, and winter came. Only when Persephone returned did the earth bloom again. The story was not just a poetic explanation. It was a ritual truth, celebrated in sacred rites that connected the people to the cycles of nature. Yet not all myths were comforting. The Greeks also told tales of hubris, the fatal pride that drew the wrath of the gods. Icarus, who flew too close to the sun despite his father's warnings, became a cautionary symbol. Niobe, who mocked the goddess Leto, saw her children struck down by Apollo and Artemis. These stories were whispered as warnings in the dark. Respect the limits set by the gods, for even kings and queens could fall. Above all, there was the epic cycle of the Trojan War. It was the war of wars, the crucible in which the ideals of heroism and tragedy were forged. It began with a quarrel among the gods, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, and the fateful judgment of Paris, Prince of Troy, who chose love over wisdom and power. His reward, Helen of Sparta, became the most famous prize in history, and her abduction sparked a decade of bloodshed. The warriors of that age were the standard by which all others were measured. Achilles, unmatched in battle, yet doomed by destiny, was the very image of the warrior spirit. Brilliant, unstoppable, but undone by rage and pride. Odysseus, master of wit and deception, proved that victory could come from guile as well as force. And Hector, noble defender of Troy, embodied the tragedy of fighting for a cause that could not be won. Though centuries had passed, the Greeks of the classical period believed themselves to be the heirs of these heroes. Their temples displayed scenes from the Trojan War, as though it were recent history. Their leaders invoked the names of Achilles and Odysseus when rallying troops. In every polis, the myths were more than entertainment. They were a call to live up to an ideal. The power of these stories was not limited to the battlefield. In politics, leaders compared themselves to wise kings of legend. In philosophy, thinkers debated the moral lessons hidden within the epics. Even in the marketplace, merchants used heroic imagery to sell their wares. Amphorae painted with the feats of gods and men became prized possessions, reminders of a glorious past. But the myths were more than mirrors of Greek values. They were also tools of unity. In a land divided by mountains and seas, where each city-state guarded its independence, the shared heritage of legend bound them together. An Athenian and a Spartan might disagree on law, politics, and even the nature of honor. But both could speak of Heracles with equal pride. Both could recite lines from Homer by heart. And yet, like all powerful ideas, myths could be twisted. Ambitious rulers claimed divine ancestry to legitimize their authority. Generals invoked the will of the gods to justify wars of conquest. Priests interpreted omens and oracles in ways that favored the powerful. In this way, the same stories that inspired courage could also be used to manipulate and control. Still, the Age of Heroes remained the golden thread running through the fabric of Greek identity. The real men and women of Greece would never fight alongside Achilles, never set sail with Jason and the Argonauts, never descend into the underworld like Orpheus. But in spirit, they walked the same paths, faced the same choices, and bore the same burdens. As the sun set over the Aegean, casting long shadows over the marble statues of gods and heroes, the Greeks of the classical age knew that they were the living chapter of an ongoing epic. The age of myth might have passed, but its echoes shaped their every ambition and fear. And in the quiet of the night, when the winds carried the sound of waves against the shore, one could almost imagine the voices of the heroes, calling out from the halls of memory, reminding the people of the glory and the cost of their inheritance.
The mountains of Greece did more than shape the land. They shaped its people. Their jagged peaks and deep valleys acted as walls and boundaries, dividing communities into small, independent settlements. Unlike the sprawling river civilizations of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Greece could not be ruled easily from a single throne. Instead, its political life grew from the ground up, rooted in local pride and the daily struggles of survival. Out of this fragmented geography emerged the polis, the city-state, the heart of Greek civilization. A polis was more than just a city. It was a community, a shared identity, and a way of life. At its center rose the Acropolis, the fortified high ground where temples and public buildings stood. Below lay the Agora, the open marketplace where merchants traded goods, philosophers debated ideas, and citizens discussed politics. Surrounding them were homes, workshops, and farmland, all within the walls when danger threatened. But what truly defined a polis was its citizenship. To be a citizen of Athens, Sparta, or Corinth was not merely to live there, it was to be part of a political and moral body. Citizenship carried privileges, the right to vote, to own land, to speak in the assembly, but also duties, to serve in the military, to uphold the laws, and to put the good of the polis above personal gain. Foreigners, women, and slaves were excluded, their fates tied to the decisions of the citizen class. No two polis were alike. Athens, with its access to the sea, turned outward, embracing trade, culture, and debate. Its leaders believed that a citizen's voice mattered, and over time, they developed the radical idea of democratia, rule by the people. The Athenian assembly was a place where farmers and merchants could stand beside nobles, speaking their minds on matters of war, law, and public spending. Far to the south, Sparta took a different path. Landlocked and surrounded by potential enemies, Sparta forged itself into a military society. Its citizens, the Spartiates, lived under a strict code of discipline. Boys were taken from their families at the age of 7 to endure the brutal agoge training system, where they learned to fight, endure pain, and obey orders without question. Women in Sparta, though not soldiers, enjoyed more rights than in other Greek states. managing estates and maintaining the household while the men were at war. Corinth, perched on the narrow isthmus linking the Peloponnesus to the mainland, became a hub of commerce. Its wealth came from controlling the overland route between two seas, and its markets bustled with goods from across the Mediterranean. Thebes, in fertile Boeotia, combined agricultural abundance with a warrior tradition, while smaller palaeas like Delphi and Olympia gained fame as religious and cultural centers. Despite their differences, all Greek city-states shared a deep sense of competition, not just in war, but in every aspect of life. They competed in the arts, in politics, in philosophy, and in sport. The Olympic Games, first held in 776 BCE, were more than athletic contests. They were a sacred festival honoring Zeus. Athletes competed naked under the gaze of the gods, their victories bringing glory not only to themselves but to their entire polis. Yet the polis was not without its flaws. Rivalries between city-states often flared into open conflict. A border dispute, a trade disagreement, or an insult to honor could quickly escalate into war. Alliances formed and dissolved with dizzying speed, and no polis could ever be certain of its friends for long. This constant tension would one day lead to the great wars that defined Greek history. For now, however, the polis was a symbol of strength and independence. Citizens saw themselves as members of a living community that was worth defending at any cost. The walls of the city were their shield, the laws their bond, and their shared identity their most prized possession. Life in the polis revolved around participation. In Athens, the assembly might meet under the open sky, where voices rose and fell as men argued policy. In Sparta, the Gerousia, the council of elders, guided decisions alongside the dual kings. In Corinth, wealthy merchant families vied for influence, shaping the city's policies to favor trade. The Greeks believed that to be human was to be political, to take part in the affairs of one's community. Religion bound the polis together. Festivals honored patron gods and goddesses: Athena for Athens, Artemis Orthia for Sparta, Poseidon for Corinth. These events were not merely religious rituals. They were opportunities for the entire community to gather, reaffirm its unity, and display its wealth and culture to visiting foreigners. The idea of the polis would outlast the cities themselves. Even when Greece eventually fell under foreign rule, the memory of the independent city-state, self-governing, proud and fiercely protective of its freedom, remained a defining element of Greek identity. It was in the polis that democracy was born, where the philosophies of Socrates and Aristotle took root, where art, drama, and architecture flourished. In these formative centuries, the foundations of Greek greatness were laid. The polis was both the source of their unity and the seed of their division, the crucible in which their values were forged, and the stage upon which their tragedies would unfold. It was here, in the narrow streets of Athens, in the training fields of Sparta, in the bustling harbors of Corinth, that the destiny of Greece began to take shape. The sun would rise and set over countless days of debate, trade, and training. Armies would march, fleets would sail, alliances would be sworn and broken. But for now, the Peleus stood proud, small in size, immense in spirit, ready to face whatever challenges the gods or fate might send. The 5th century BCE dawned with both promise and peril for the Greek world. The city-states had grown in strength, their ships ranging farther across the seas, their culture blossoming in art, drama, and philosophy. Yet beyond the Aegean, in the vast expanse of Asia, a shadow was rising, a power so great that it stretched from the valleys of the Indus to the shores of the Mediterranean. This was the Persian Empire, and its gaze had turned toward Greece. Founded by Cyrus the Great and expanded by Darius I, Persia was unlike anything the Greeks had ever faced. It was a land of immense resources, ruled by a king whose word was law, supported by a massive army of infantry, cavalry, and fearsome archers. Its provinces, satrapies, stretched across countless cultures, and its wealth dwarfed that of any single Greek polis. To the Greeks, Persia was at once a marvel and a menace, a glittering empire whose power threatened to sweep away their hard-won independence. The conflict began not in mainland Greece, but in Ionia, the chain of Greek cities along the western coast of Asia Minor. These cities had fallen under Persian rule, but still cherished their Greek heritage. In 499 BCE, resentment boiled over into the Ionian revolt. Backed by Athens and the small city of Eretria, the Ionians dared to defy the great king. They even managed to burn Sardis, a Persian provincial capital, in a bold act of rebellion. Darius, enraged, swore vengeance. Herodotus claimed that the king ordered a servant to remind him every day at dinner, "Sire, remember the Athenians." For Persia, punishing Athens was no longer just a matter of empire, it was personal. In 490 BCE, the first great clash came at Marathon. The Persians landed their forces on the plains northeast of Athens, expecting an easy victory. They outnumbered the Athenians, who had only a small contingent from the city of Plataea as allies. Yet, under the command of Miltiades, the Athenians struck with daring speed, charging across the field before the Persian cavalry could fully deploy. The heavy hoplite armor and disciplined phalanx formation broke through the lighter Persian troops, and the invaders were driven back to their ships. It was a victory that astonished the world. Athens had defied the greatest empire on earth, and won. The legend of the messenger Phidippides, who ran from Marathon to Athens to announce the triumph before collapsing, became part of the city's proud memory. But in truth, the victory at Marathon was only the beginning. 10 years later, vengeance returned, this time in the form of Xerxes I, son of Darius. Determined to crush Greece once and for all, Xerxes assembled a colossal army and fleet. Ancient sources, prone to exaggeration, claimed millions marched under his banner, but even conservative estimates suggest a force the likes of which Greece had never seen. Bridges of boats were built across the Hellespont to carry the army into Europe, and supply lines stretched for miles. The Greek response was desperate but united, at least for a moment. The city-states formed the Hellenic League, led by Sparta on land and Athens at sea. Their first stand came at the narrow pass of Thermopylae in 480 BC, where King Leonidas of Sparta and his small force of 300 Spartans, joined by several thousand allies, held back the Persian advance for 3 days. Though betrayed and surrounded, they fought to the last, their sacrifice buying precious time for the rest of Greece. At sea, the Athenian-led fleet clashed with the Persians at Artemisium, and later at Salamis. Here, cunning turned the tide. Themistocles, Athens' brilliant naval strategist, lured the massive Persian fleet into the narrow straits, where their numbers became a hindrance. Greek triremes, sleek, fast, and deadly, rammed and shattered the cumbersome Persian ships. Xerxes, watching from a golden throne on the shore, saw his navy broken before his eyes. The final blow came the following year at Plataea, where a united Greek army crushed the remaining Persian land forces. The great king's ambitions in Greece were ended, and the threat of conquest was lifted. These victories became the stuff of legend, celebrated in poetry, sculpture, and festival. They were proof, in the Greek mind, that free men fighting for their homeland could triumph over the mightiest empire. Yet beneath the triumph lay seeds of future discord. Athens emerged from the wars as a naval superpower, its fleet unmatched, its confidence soaring. Sparta remained the land's supreme military force, proud of its role at Thermopylae and Plataea. The alliance that had saved Greece would soon fracture. Rivalry, ambition, and mistrust would once again take root among the Palaeus. But for a brief, shining moment, Greece had stood together against the world's greatest power, and prevailed. The Persian threat had tested the very soul of the Greek world. In the fire of that conflict, their identity as defenders of freedom was forged. And yet, as history would show, the greatest dangers to Greece would not come from the east, but from within. The dust of the Persian wars had barely settled when Athens stepped into a new destiny. From a modest coastal polis, it transformed into the cultural and political heart of Greece, a beacon whose light would burn brightly for decades and whose influence would echo for millennia. This was the golden age of Athens, a period when democracy flourished. Art reached new heights, philosophy dared to challenge the mind, and the city's navy ruled the Aegean. The rise of Athenian power, the victory over Persia, had brought Athens not just glory but strategic dominance. Its fleet, the very weapon that had turned the tide at Salamis, became the foundation of a new maritime empire. In 478 BCE, Athens and its allies formed the Delian League, a coalition meant to defend against future Persian aggression. The League's treasury was kept on the sacred island of Delos, its silver reserves contributed by member states. At first, the alliance was mutual, but as years passed, Athens began to exert more control, turning the League into a tool of its own power. Allies who tried to leave found themselves facing Athenian warships. Tribute flowed into Athens, funding massive building projects and strengthening the city's dominance. In time, the League's treasury was moved from Delos to Athens, a symbolic act that announced Athens' role not as first among equals, but as master. Democracy in action. Under leaders like Pericles, Athens refined its democracy into something remarkable for the ancient world. The assembly, the ecclesia, was open to all male citizens, who could debate and vote on laws, military campaigns, and public spending. Public offices were often filled by lot to prevent corruption, and citizens were paid for their service, allowing even the poor to participate. Pericles himself was a statesman of rare vision. Charismatic and eloquent, he guided Athens with a steady hand for decades. He championed the idea that Athens was not just a city, but a model for all Greece, a place where citizens could shape their own destiny and where culture was as important as power. The splendor of the city. Nowhere was Athens' confidence more visible than in its architecture. The Acropolis, once a fortress, became a stage for art and devotion. The crown jewel was the Parthenon, a temple dedicated to Athena Parthenos, the city's patron goddess, designed by architects Ectinus and Callicrates, and adorned by the sculptor Phidias. The Parthenon embodied the harmony, proportion, and beauty that defined classical Greek art. Beyond the Acropolis, Athens teemed with life. The Agora bustled with merchants selling olive oil, pottery, and imported goods. Philosophers like Anaxagoras and later Socrates could be found engaging in lively debates under the colonnades. Dramatists, such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, filled the theatres with plays that explored the human condition. Tragedies of kings brought low by fate. Comedies that mocked politics and society. Culture and innovation. Athens in this age was not merely a city of stone and marble. It was a city of ideas. The tragedians explored themes of justice, vengeance, and the limits of human power. Comedies by Aristophanes poked fun at political leaders and mocked war itself. Sculptors perfected the portrayal of the human form, capturing both physical beauty and inner emotion. Education was highly valued. Boys studied music, mathematics, rhetoric, and gymnastics, preparing to be both thinkers and defenders of the polis. Public festivals, such as the Panathenea, blended religious devotion with athletic competition, poetry, and music, turning the city into a living celebration of its own greatness. The shadow beneath the light, yet the brilliance of Athens carried its own shadow. The democracy that gave voice to its citizens excluded women, slaves, and foreigners, who made up a large part of the population. The wealth that funded its splendor came in part from the enforced tributes of its so-called allies in the Delian League. Athens' growing arrogance alienated other city-states, none more so than Sparta. Relations between Athens and Sparta grew colder with each passing year. The two powers had stood shoulder to shoulder at Plataea, but their visions for Greece were incompatible. Athens embraced openness, trade, and naval supremacy. Sparta clung to its land-based military strength and austere discipline. Minor disputes flared into diplomatic crises. The Greek world began to divide into two camps, those who stood with Athens and those who looked to Sparta. Pericles' vision. Pericles understood the danger but also believed in Athens' destiny. In his famous funeral oration, delivered during the early years of the looming Peloponnesian War, he declared Athens an education to Greece, a city whose example of freedom, culture, and civic engagement was unmatched. His words captured the pride of a people who saw themselves not only as victors, but as leaders of the Hellenic world. The calm before the storm. For a generation, Athens basked in its golden age. Ships sailed from Piraeus laden with goods and ideas, returning with treasures from across the Mediterranean. Artisans carved marble, playwrights filled the stages, and philosophers questioned the very nature of reality. To live in Athens during this time was to be at the heart of a civilization at its peak, confident, creative, and, perhaps, too sure of itself. The city's power was dazzling, but its rivals seethed with resentment. Sparta watched warily as Athens tightened its grip on the Aegean. Corinth bristled at Athenian interference in trade. Even allies began to wonder if Athens' leadership was just another form of tyranny. The age of cultural brilliance was also the age of imperial ambition. And ambition, as the Greeks knew from their myths, often brought the wrath of fate. The Golden Age had given Athens everything: wealth, beauty, influence, and pride. But it had also set the stage for the greatest conflict the Greek world had ever seen. Soon, the thunder of war drums would drown the music of the lyre, and the marble splendor of Athens would stand under the shadow of siege. By the middle of the 5th century BCE, the Greek world stood at a crossroads. Two powers, Athens and Sparta, had risen from the victory over Persia as champions of different ideals. Athens, radiant in its golden age, was a city of sailors, traders, artists, and philosophers. Sparta, austere and unyielding, was a city of warriors forged in discipline and silence. Their alliance during the Persian Wars had been one of necessity, not friendship. Now, that uneasy partnership had dissolved into suspicion, rivalry, and finally, war. The road to conflict, the seeds of the Peloponnesian War, were sown in the decades following the Persian threat. Athens, through the Delian League, had turned a defensive alliance into an empire. Tribute from subject states filled the city's treasury, funding grand temples and a formidable navy. Sparta, at the head of the Peloponnesian League, maintained its dominance on land and viewed Athens' growing power as a direct threat to the balance of Greece. Small disputes became flashpoints. In 433 BCE, Athens allied with Corcyra, modern Corfu, against Corinth, a key Spartan ally. The following year, Athens imposed a trade embargo on Megara, another Spartan partner. These acts, combined with decades of mutual distrust, made war inevitable. In 431 BCE, Sparta declared war, and the conflict that would last nearly 3 decades began. The war begins. The opening years saw contrasting strategies. Athens, under the leadership of Pericles, avoided direct land battles with Sparta's superior hoplites. Instead, it relied on its navy to raid enemy coasts, secure trade routes, and pressure Spartan allies. Behind the city's long walls, which connected Athens to its port of Piraeus, the Athenians could be supplied by sea, rendering them nearly impregnable to siege. Sparta, for its part, invaded the Athenian countryside year after year, burning crops and devastating farmland in an effort to draw Athens into open battle. Yet the Athenians stayed within their walls, letting the Spartans waste their strength. It was a sound strategy, until disaster struck from within. In 430 BCE, a devastating plague swept through overcrowded Athens. Brought in through the port, it spread rapidly among the packed population, killing tens of thousands, including Pericles himself. Without his steady leadership, Athens entered a turbulent period of shifting policies and political rivalries. The shifting tide, the war, became a grinding struggle, with periods of uneasy truces and sudden flare-ups. Sparta suffered naval defeats. Athens endured costly land campaigns. In 421 BCE, both sides agreed to the Peace of Nicias, a treaty meant to last 50 years. It lasted barely 6. In 415 BCE, Athens embarked on the ill-fated Sicilian expedition, a massive campaign to conquer Syracuse, far to the west. Ambition and overconfidence drove the decision. Despite warnings from cautious voices like Nicias, the result was catastrophic. The Athenian fleet was destroyed, thousands of soldiers were killed or captured, and the city's prestige was shattered. Sparta seized the opportunity. With Persian financial support, it built a navy to challenge Athens at sea. One by one, Athens' allies revolted, and the city's resources dwindled. Internal political strife further weakened the democracy, with coups and counter-coups shaking the polis. The final blow, the decisive moment, came in 405 BCE at the Battle of Aegospotami, where the Spartan commander Lysander trapped and annihilated the Athenian fleet. With its ships gone, Athens was cut off from grain supplies in the Black Sea. Starvation set in, and in 404 BCE, after months of siege, Athens surrendered. The terms were harsh. Athens had to dismantle its long walls, surrender its fleet, and submit to Sparta's leadership. The democracy was briefly replaced by an oligarchy, the 30 tyrants, whose brutal rule left deep scars. A war without winners. The Peloponnesian War had reshaped Greece, but not for the better. Sparta emerged as the nominal victor, yet its resources were drained, and its rigid system ill-suited for managing an empire. Athens, though humbled, remained a center of culture and learning, but its political and military power was broken. Many smaller city-states had been ravaged, their populations diminished, and their economies crippled. The war had also changed Greek warfare itself. The old code of limited conflict between city-states had given way to total war, sieges, massacres, and the use of foreign powers like Persia to tip the balance. The The ideals celebrated in the Golden Age seemed distant now, replaced by a harsher, more cynical view of power. The legacy of strife. Thucydides, the great historian of the war, wrote not only of battles and strategies, but of human nature, of how fear, honor, and interest drive nations into conflict. His work remains a timeless study of the dangers of rivalry and the fragility of alliances. Though the Peloponnesian War had ended, the Greek world would never return to its former unity. The rivalry between Athens and Sparta had left both weakened, paving the way for a new power to rise from the north, one that would soon conquer all of Greece. The stage was set for the next act in the drama of Hellenic history, the rise of Macedon. In the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, the once mighty Greek world lay fractured. Athens, stripped of its empire, clung to its cultural prestige, but no longer commanded the seas. Sparta, though victorious, found itself overextended, burdened by restless allies and a rigid social system ill-suited for ruling a scattered empire. Thebes, Corinth, and other city-states sought their own advantage, forming and breaking alliances in a restless cycle. The age of unity was gone. The age of opportunism had begun. Amid this chaos, a power long dismissed by the southern Greeks began to stir. Macedonia. To the cultured Athenians and disciplined Spartans, Macedonia was a rough, semi-barbaric kingdom on the northern fringes of the Hellenic world, known more for its horsemen and rugged warriors than for philosophy or art. But beneath this image lay a kingdom poised to seize its moment. A kingdom in transition for centuries. Macedonia had been overshadowed by its southern neighbors. Its kings claimed descent from Heracles, but its politics were unstable, its nobility fractious, and its territory vulnerable to Thracian raids and Illyrian incursions. The turning point came with the ascent of Philip II in 359 BCE. Philip was no ordinary king, educated in Thebes during his youth as a political hostage. He had studied Greek warfare closely, observing the strengths and weaknesses of the city-state armies. When he returned to Macedonia, he brought with him a vision of reform, and the determination to carry it out. Philip transformed the Macedonian army into a professional, disciplined force. His most significant innovation was the Macedonian phalanx, a formation of infantry armed with the sarissa, a spear twice the length of the traditional Greek hoplite weapon. The longer reach, combined with tight discipline, made the phalanx nearly unstoppable in frontal assault. He also strengthened the cavalry, integrating it more closely with the infantry in battle. This combination of speed, reach, and coordination gave Macedonia a military edge over the fragmented Greek city-states. Philip understood that war alone would not secure his kingdom. He employed diplomacy, marriage alliances, and bribes as effectively as his armies. He married into powerful Thessalian and Epirote families, while sowing divisions among his rivals to keep them weak and distracted. The expansion of power over the next 2 decades, Philip steadily expanded Macedonia's influence. He secured its borders, crushed rebellious tribes, and extended control over key trade routes. His campaigns in Thrace and against the Illyrians brought wealth and resources to the kingdom, funding further military growth. The southern Greek city-states watched with growing concern. Athens, in particular, saw Macedonia's rise as a threat, but was too consumed by its own political divisions to act decisively. Orators like Demosthenes warned of Philippus' ambitions in a series of fiery speeches known as the Philippics, but his words fell on ears dulled by years of internal strife. The turning point. In 338 BCE, the inevitable clash came. Philip marched south, uniting or subduing territories along the way. Thebes and Athens set aside their differences to face him, forming a coalition of city-states determined to preserve Greek independence. The armies met at Chaeronea in Boeotia. Philip commanded the Macedonian right wing, while his young son, Alexander, led the left. The battle was fierce, but Macedonian discipline and tactics prevailed. Alexander, only 18, played a decisive role, charging with the companion cavalry to shatter the enemy line. By day's end, the Greek coalition was broken. The victory at Chaeronea marked the end of the independent city-state era. Philip established the League of Corinth, a federation of Greek states united under Macedonian leadership, ostensibly to launch a war against Persia. In reality, it was a mechanism to secure Philip's dominance, while granting the appearance of autonomy. The unfinished dream. Philip's plans for the Persian campaign were ambitious. With Greece under his command, he intended to cross into Asia and take the war to the very heart of the empire that had once threatened Greece. But in 336 BCE, on the eve of his invasion, Philip was assassinated, struck down during a festival in Asia. The reasons remain debated: personal vendetta, political conspiracy, or even the maneuverings of his own court. Whatever the truth, the mantle of leadership passed to his 20-year-old son, Alexander. Many doubted the youth's ability to hold the empire together, let alone carry out his father's grand designs. But Alexander would soon prove himself not only capable, but extraordinary. The legacy of Philip II. Philip had achieved what no other had: the unification of Greece, albeit under Macedonian rule. He had transformed a peripheral kingdom into the dominant power of the Hellenic world. His military reforms and political cunning laid the foundation for what was to come, an empire that would stretch from Greece to the edges of the known world. For the Greek city-states, Philip's rise was both an end and a beginning. Their cherished independence was gone, yet their culture was about to embark on its greatest journey, carried eastward by the armies of a king whose name would be remembered for centuries: Alexander the Great. When Alexander III of Macedon, later known as Alexander the Great, took the throne in 336 BCE, many across Greece and beyond saw him as little more than a young prince with a famous father. He was just 20 years old, his authority untested, his grip on power uncertain. But within 2 years, the world would know his name, and within a decade, he would change the map of the known world forever. Securing the throne, Alexander's first months as king were perilous. News of Philip II's assassination emboldened rivals and rebellious territories. In the north, the Thracians and Illyrians rose against Macedonian rule. In the south, some Greek city-states, led by Thebes, saw a chance to throw off Macedonian dominance. Alexander moved with lightning speed. He marched north, crushing the northern tribes and securing Macedonia's borders. Then he turned south, descending upon Greece before rebellion could take root. Thebes, defying him, was made an example. In 335 BCE, Alexander destroyed the city, sparing only temples and the house of the poet Pindar. The brutal message was clear: Macedonian rule was not to be challenged. Athens, though wary, chose diplomacy over defiance. The League of Corinth, reformed under Alexander's leadership, confirmed him as supreme commander of the Greek forces for the campaign against Persia. The mission his father had envisioned, crossing into Asia in the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander led an army of roughly 40,000 men across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. Before stepping onto Persian soil, he made a symbolic gesture, throwing a spear into the ground, declaring the land won by the spear. His campaign was not framed as mere conquest, but as vengeance for Persia's past invasions of Greece. The first great test came at the Battle of the Granicus River. Persian satraps and Greek mercenaries awaited him, confident they could repel the young invader. Alexander, leading his companion cavalry, charged across the river under a hail of arrows, breaking the enemy line in a furious clash. Victory opened the gateway into Asia Minor, and city after city fell under Macedonian control. The Gordian, not as Alexander advanced. He came to the city of Gordium, home to a legendary knot tied so intricately that it was said no one could untangle it. An oracle had prophesied that whoever solved the puzzle would rule all of Asia. Alexander, faced with the challenge, is said to have drawn his sword and cut the knot in two. Whether fact or legend, the act became a symbol of his bold, unconventional approach to obstacles. The Battle of Issus in 333 BCE. Alexander faced the Persian king Darius III for the first time at Issus in modern-day Turkey. Darius commanded a vastly larger force, but the narrow terrain neutralized his advantage. Alexander personally led the charge against the Persian center, sending Darius fleeing the battlefield. The capture of Darius' family, treated with great respect by Alexander, marked a psychological blow to the Persian court. Siege of Tyre and conquest of Egypt. Rather than pursuing Darius immediately, Alexander turned to secure the eastern Mediterranean. The island city of Tyre resisted, confident in its impregnable walls and powerful navy. For 7 months, Alexander besieged the city, building a causeway across the sea to breach its defenses. When Tyre finally fell in 332 BCE, it was a testament to Alexander's determination and engineering genius. From there, he marched into Egypt, where the Persians were despised as foreign oppressors. Alexander was welcomed as a liberator. In the Nile Delta, he founded Alexandria, a city that would become a beacon of learning and trade for centuries. Visiting the oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis, Alexander was hailed as the son of the god, a claim he neither confirmed nor denied, but one that would enhance his aura of divine destiny. The decisive clash Gaugamela in 331 BCE. Alexander faced Darius once more at Gaugamela, in present-day Iraq. Darius had assembled a massive army, complete with war elephants and scythed chariots, on a battlefield chosen to maximize his advantage. Alexander's tactics, however, were flawless. Feigning a retreat to draw the Persians out of position, he created a gap in their line and led a decisive cavalry charge straight at Darius. Once again, the great king fled, leaving his empire in disarray. The victory at Gaugamela was the death knell for the Persian Empire. Alexander entered Babylon as a conqueror, then pressed on to Susa and Persepolis, the Persian ceremonial capital. Persepolis was plundered, and in a symbolic act, whether drunken revelry or calculated statement, parts of the city were set ablaze, avenging the Persian burning of Athens' temples a century earlier. Pursuit to the ends of the earth, Darius III fled east, pursued relentlessly by Alexander. Before the Macedonian king could capture him, Darius was murdered by his own satrap, Bessus. Alexander, furious, gave Darius a royal burial and vowed to hunt down the usurper, which he soon did. But conquest had become more than vengeance. It was now a quest without clear limits. Over the next years, Alexander pushed into Central Asia, founding cities, marrying local princesses, and blending Greek and Eastern cultures. His campaigns took him through the mountains of Bactria, across the Hindu Kush, and into India, where he faced King Paras at the Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BC. Though victorious, the battle was costly, and his army, weary and longing for home, refused to march farther east. Legacy in the making by the time Alexander turned back toward Babylon. His empire stretched from Greece to Egypt, across Asia Minor, through Persia, and into India. He was more than a conqueror. He was a bridge between worlds, spreading Hellenic culture far beyond its homeland. Greek became the language of administration and learning across his territories, setting the stage for the Hellenistic Age. But Alexander's relentless drive would soon take its toll. In 323 BCE, at the height of his power, he would meet an untimely death, leaving his vast empire without a clear heir, and plunging it into chaos. For now, though, in the wake of Gaugamela and the fall of Persia, Alexander stood as the undisputed master of the known world, a figure who seemed to walk in the footsteps of both heroes and gods. When Alexander the Great returned to Babylon in 323 BCE, he was only 32 years old, but he had already built the largest empire the world had ever seen. From the mountains of Macedonia to the banks of the Indus River, his banners flew over cities that blended Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and countless other cultures. Yet the vastness of his conquests was matched only by the instability of his rule. For while Alexander had conquered nations, he had not yet forged a clear plan for succession. The final days in early June of 323 BCE, Alexander fell ill after a banquet. Ancient sources disagree on the cause. Some speak of fever brought on by exhaustion and wounds, others hint at poisoning, though no definitive proof exists. For days, he lay unable to speak, surrounded by his generals and companions. The empire he had carved through brilliance and blood stood on the edge of uncertainty. When asked to whom he left his empire, he is said to have whispered, "To the strongest." Whether he meant this as a challenge or a grim prediction, the words proved prophetic. On June 10, 323 BCE, Alexander died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. His body was placed in a golden coffin, destined to be transported to Macedonia, though it would never reach its intended resting place. An empire without an heir. Alexander's sudden death left a vacuum at the heart of the empire. His half-brother, Philip III Aridius, was mentally unfit to rule. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant, and her child Alexander IV would not be born for several months. In the absence of a clear, capable heir, Alexander's top generals, the Diadochi successors, met in Babylon to decide the empire's fate. The arrangement they reached was a fragile compromise. Philip III and the unborn Alexander IV would be joint kings, with the generals ruling as regents over different territories. But this unity was an illusion. Each man harbored ambitions of personal power, and the empire's days as a single entity were numbered. The wars of the successors begin. The first cracks appeared almost immediately. Perdiccas, Alexander's trusted cavalry commander, took the role of regent, but his authority was challenged by others, including Antipater in Macedonia, Ptolemy in Egypt, and Antigonus in Asia Minor. The struggle became personal when Ptolemy intercepted Alexander's funeral cortege, diverting it to Egypt. By seizing the body, Ptolemy claimed a symbolic connection to Alexander's legacy, and provoked Perdiccas to launch a failed invasion of Egypt, which ended in the regent's assassination by his own officers. From this point, the empire descended into a series of brutal conflicts known as the Wars of the Successors. Alliances shifted constantly, battles were fought across deserts, seas, and mountains, and assassination was as common a weapon as the sword. Ptolemy consolidated his rule in Egypt, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty that would last for nearly 3 centuries. Seleucus, once a commander of the elite companion cavalry, carved out a vast empire stretching from Asia Minor to the Indus, known as the Seleucid Empire. Antigonus the One-Eyed sought to reunite Alexander's empire under his own rule, but was ultimately defeated at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE by a coalition of his rivals. In Macedonia and Greece, Cassander took control, executing Alexander's widow Roxana and the young Alexander IV to eliminate any legitimate heirs. The birth of the Hellenistic world. Though the empire fractured, Alexander's legacy endured in the Hellenistic Age, a period when Greek culture blended with the traditions of Egypt, Persia, and the East. Greek became the common language of trade and administration. Cities like Alexandria in Egypt and Antioch in Syria became centers of learning, commerce, and art. Philosophy, science, and mathematics flourished under this cultural fusion. Euclid formalized geometry, Archimedes advanced engineering, and scholars at the Library of Alexandria pursued knowledge from every corner of the known world. In art and architecture, Greek styles merged with local influences, producing grand temples, lifelike sculptures, and sprawling urban centers. Yet the Hellenistic kingdoms were not peaceful utopias. They were locked in near constant rivalry, each seeking dominance over the others. The successors and their descendants ruled as monarchs in the mold of Alexander, but none could match his genius for uniting vast, diverse lands. The shadow of Rome, as the successors fought among themselves, a new power was rising in the West. Rome, still a republic, began expanding its influence across the Italian peninsula and into the Mediterranean. At first, the Hellenistic kings saw Rome as a distant player in their own chess game. They did not realize that within 2 centuries, the legions of Rome would march into Greece and Asia, bringing an end to the independence of the Hellenistic states. A legacy that endured. Alexander's empire had lasted barely a decade, but its impact would echo for centuries. He had spread Greek language, art, and ideas across continents, creating a world where an Egyptian could read Homer, a Persian could debate Aristotle's philosophy, and a Greek merchant could trade in India. The wars of the successors were bloody and destructive, yet they ensured that Hellenic culture remained embedded in the lands Alexander had conquered. Even Rome, when it rose to supremacy, would inherit and preserve much of this cultural wealth. In the end, Alexander's dying words had come true. His empire went to the strongest, but strength alone could not hold it together. What remained was a shattered mosaic of kingdoms, bound less by political unity than by the shared memory of the man who had forged them. The death of Alexander the Great had shattered his empire, but it had also unleashed a cultural force that would ripple across 3 continents. This was the Hellenistic Age, a time when Greek ideas, language, and art blended with the traditions of Egypt, Persia, and the East, creating a rich, interconnected world unlike any that had come before. A new world order. The wars of the successors had left 3 dominant kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, ruled by Ptolemy and his descendants; the Seleucid Empire, stretching from Asia Minor deep into Persia, under Seleucus and his heirs; the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia and parts of Greece, controlled by Antigonus' lineage. Other states, such as the Kingdom of Pergamon in Asia Minor and Greco-Bactria in Central Asia, emerged in the centuries that followed. While they often fought for territory and influence, all of them were united by a shared cultural thread: the Greek language and the Hellenic tradition. Alexandria, jewel of the Mediterranean. At the heart of this new age was Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded on the Nile Delta. Under the Ptolemies, it became the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world. The Library of Alexandria, said to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls, attracted scholars from across the known world, mathematicians, philosophers, historians, and poets. Here, Euclid wrote the Elements, the foundational text of geometry, while Archimedes studied the principles of mechanics and engineering. Adjacent to the library stood the museum, a center of learning and research supported by royal patronage. The city's harbor was dominated by the Pharos of Alexandria, a towering lighthouse considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guiding ships from distant shores to its bustling markets. Blending of cultures. The Hellenistic Age was defined by cultural fusion. Greek art adopted Eastern motifs, and local traditions were reimagined through a Hellenic lens. In sculpture, artists pursued realism, portraying not only gods and heroes but also children, the elderly, and everyday life with lifelike detail. Architecture combined Greek symmetry with the monumental scale of the East, producing grand temples, theaters, and palaces. In religion, syncretism flourished. Greek gods were identified with local deities, Zeus with the Egyptian Amen, Aphrodite with the Near Eastern Ishtar. This blending created new forms of worship, appealing to diverse populations within the sprawling kingdoms. Science, philosophy, and learning, the pursuit of knowledge, thrived in this cosmopolitan atmosphere. Astronomy advanced under scholars like Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun centuries before Copernicus. Geography saw breakthroughs from Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. Medicine evolved under Herophilos and Erasistratus, who dissected human bodies to study anatomy. Philosophy branched into new schools, Epicureanism, advocating for a life of moderate pleasure and tranquility, Stoicism, promoting virtue and endurance, and skepticism, questioning the certainty of human knowledge. These ideas spread across the Mediterranean, shaping the thought of future civilizations, including Rome. Trade and prosperity. Economically, the Hellenistic kingdoms thrived on expansive trade networks. Goods flowed along routes stretching from Spain to India. Egyptian grain fed growing populations. Spices and silk came from the east. Greek wine and olive oil found markets across the seas. Coins bearing the images of Hellenistic kings circulated widely, symbolizing both economic unity and political rivalry. New cities sprang up along trade routes: Antioch in Syria, Seleucia on the Tigris, and Pergamon in Asia Minor, each a hub of commerce and culture. Greek became the lingua franca of diplomacy and business, allowing merchants and scholars from different lands to communicate with ease. Tensions and decline. Yet beneath the prosperity lay instability. The kingdoms were often at war with one another, draining resources and weakening defenses. Local populations sometimes resisted Greek cultural dominance, leading to uprisings. In Egypt, native revolts challenged Ptolemaic authority. In the east, the Seleucids struggled to control distant provinces. Most importantly, a new power was rising in the west: Rome. At first, the Hellenistic kings saw Rome as a useful ally or a distant concern. But Roman intervention in Greek affairs, beginning with the Macedonian Wars, marked the slow erosion of Hellenistic independence. The lasting legacy. Despite its political fragility, the Hellenistic Age left an enduring mark on history. Greek culture, once confined to the Aegean, became a shared heritage across a vast and diverse world. Art, architecture, science, and philosophy flourished under royal patronage, creating a cultural legacy that Rome would inherit and preserve. When Rome eventually conquered the Hellenistic kingdoms, it did not erase them. Instead, it absorbed their ideas, their art, and their language, ensuring that the achievements of this age would echo through the centuries. The Hellenistic world was, in many ways, the fulfillment of Alexander's dream, a vast, interconnected civilization united by a common culture, yet enriched by diversity. But like all empires, it carried within it the seeds of its own end. By the 3rd century BCE, the Hellenistic kingdoms seemed secure in their power. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt from the marble palaces of Alexandria. The Seleucids governed a sprawling realm from Antioch to the borders of India, and the Antigonids controlled Macedonia and much of Greece. Greek language, art, and ideas dominated the eastern Mediterranean, and the great cities of the age bustled with trade and learning. Yet, in the West, far beyond the Hellenistic sphere of influence, a new force was emerging: the Roman Republic. What began as a city-state on the Tiber River had through relentless warfare and political discipline, conquered the Italian peninsula. Rome's expansionist momentum was only beginning, and its gaze would soon turn toward the Greek world. First contacts, the initial interactions between Rome and the Hellenistic states were cautious. Rome's first major contact with the Greek sphere came indirectly, through its wars with Carthage during the Punic Wars 264 to 146 BCE. As Roman power grew in the western Mediterranean, Greek colonies in southern Italy, known as Magna Graecia, became entangled in Roman affairs. The turning point came with Pyrrhus of Epirus, a brilliant Hellenistic king who intervened in 280 BCE to aid the Greek city of Tarentum against Rome. Pyrrhus, a relative of Alexander the Great, brought with him war elephants and the tactics of the Macedonian phalanx. He won costly victories, so costly that the term Pyrrhic victory was born, but ultimately failed to halt Rome's advance. His defeat marked the beginning of Rome's encroachment into the Greek world. The Macedonian Wars, Rome's real entry into Greek politics, began in the 2nd century BCE with the Macedonian Wars. The Antigonid kings of Macedonia, seeking to protect their influence, became entangled with Rome's interests in the region. First Macedonian War 214 to 205 BCE, fought alongside the Second Punic War. It ended in a stalemate but set the stage for deeper Roman involvement. Second Macedonian War 201-97 BCE, Rome, presenting itself as the liberator of Greece from Macedonian domination, defeated King Philip V at the Battle of Nicéphalae. The flexibility of the Roman legion proved superior to the rigid Macedonian phalanx in a grand display at the Isthmian Games in 196 BCE. The Roman general Titus Quinctius Flamininus proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks. The crowd erupted in joy, but this freedom would prove short-lived. From ally to master, Rome's liberation of Greece was less an act of generosity than a strategic foothold. The Greek city-states, fractured by rivalries, quickly fell into disputes that invited Roman arbitration. The Seleucid Empire, under Antiochus III, sought to expand into Greece but was defeated by Rome at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BCE, forcing the Seleucids to abandon ambitions west of Asia Minor. The Antigonid dynasty of Macedonia fell in the Third Macedonian War 171 to 168 BCE, when Perseus of Macedon was crushed at the Battle of Pydna. Again, the Roman legion's flexibility outmaneuvered the phalanx, signaling the end of Macedonia as an independent kingdom. Rome divided the territory into client republics, weakening it further. The sack of Corinth, the final blow to Greek political independence, came in 146 BCE, when the Achaean League, a federation of Greek city-states, rose in revolt against Roman dominance. The rebellion was crushed, and Corinth, one of Greece's most prosperous cities, was sacked. Its treasures were carried to Rome, its population sold into slavery. The same year, Rome destroyed Carthage, eliminating its last major Western rival. With these twin victories, Rome became the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. From this point forward, Greece existed under Roman control, first as a patchwork of client states, later as a formal province. The proud city-states that had once defied Persia and fought each other for supremacy were now subjects of a foreign power. Hellenistic Egypt and the shadow of Rome. Even as mainland Greece fell, the Ptolemies of Egypt clung to their independence. Alexandria remained a jewel of the ancient world, a center of learning and commerce. But dynastic intrigue, assassinations, and civil wars weakened the Ptolemaic court. Rome, ever the opportunist, positioned itself as the kingdom's protector, intervening in its politics and slowly tightening its grip. By the time of Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic ruler, Egypt was effectively a Roman client state. Cleopatra's famous alliances and romances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were desperate gambits to preserve Egypt's autonomy. In 31 BCE, after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, Egypt fell to Rome, marking the end of the last Hellenistic kingdom. The end of the Hellenistic Age, the fall of Egypt in 30 BCE, closed the chapter on the Hellenistic Age. Rome now ruled from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, absorbing the cultural wealth of the Greek world into its own civilization. Greek art, literature, philosophy, and science deeply influenced Roman culture, so much so that Rome saw itself not as the destroyer of Greece, but as its heir. Yet for the Greeks, the loss of political independence was profound. The polis, once the heart of civic life, survived only as a cultural memory. The language of Homer and Aristotle still flourished, but it was now spoken under Roman authority. A legacy transformed. Though Greece's political power had ended, its cultural legacy entered a new phase. Greek scholars taught Roman elites, Greek architects shaped Roman temples, Greek philosophers influenced Roman law and governance. In this sense, Greece conquered its conqueror, not with armies, but with ideas. Rome's dominance ensured that Hellenistic achievements would be preserved and transmitted through the centuries. When the Roman Empire eventually fell, it would be the Byzantine Greeks, heirs of both Rome and classical Greece, who carried the flame into the medieval world. The political independence of the Greek world had been extinguished, but its cultural light continued to burn, illuminating civilizations far beyond the shores of the Aegean. When the dust of conquest settled and the last embers of Greek independence were extinguished, the land of Homer, Pericles, and Alexander found itself within the embrace and the chains of the Roman Empire. Yet the relationship between conqueror and conquered was unlike most in history. For while Rome wielded military and political dominance, Greece held sway in the realms of culture, intellect, and the arts. It was a paradox. Greece was politically subordinate, yet culturally sovereign. The political landscape after the sack of Corinth in 146 BCE, mainland Greece became a Roman province in all but name, governed indirectly through allied states and local authorities. Macedonia, already subdued after the Third Macedonian War, was formally organized as the Roman province of Macedonia. Southern Greece, known as Achaia, retained a semblance of local governance under the watchful eye of Roman governors. In the early years, Rome exercised a relatively light touch, preferring to maintain stability through existing political structures. Greek city-states still held assemblies, magistrates, and festivals, but major decisions, foreign policy, and taxation were now subject to Roman approval. Over time, Rome's grip tightened, especially as uprisings or disputes gave the empire an excuse to intervene more directly. Cultural prestige despite political subjugation. Greek culture retained an aura of prestige that Rome itself admired, even envied. Roman aristocrats sent their sons to Athens, Rhodes, and other centers of learning to study rhetoric, philosophy, and literature. Cicero, one of Rome's greatest orators, openly declared himself a student of Greek thought. Greek tutors, philosophers, and physicians became fixtures in the households of the Roman elite. The arts flourished under this patronage. Greek sculptors were commissioned to adorn Roman villas, while copies of classical masterpieces filled public spaces in Rome. Temples in the Greek style rose across the empire, blending Greek design with Roman engineering. To the Romans, Greek culture was the mark of refinement, the badge of a civilized man. Athens, in the Roman era Athens, though no longer the political powerhouse of the classical age, experienced a cultural renaissance under Roman patronage. The city's philosophical schools, the Academy, the Lyceum, the Stoa, and the Garden, continued to attract students from across the Mediterranean. Roman benefactors funded new buildings and restored ancient ones, eager to associate themselves with the city's illustrious past. Emperors themselves paid homage. Hadrian, in the 2nd century CE, endowed Athens with public works, including a grand library, and the completion of the Temple of Olympian Zeus, a project left unfinished for centuries. In gratitude, the Athenians honored him as a new benefactor hero, blending Roman imperial cult with local traditions. Life for ordinary Greeks. For the average Greek, Roman rule brought both burdens and opportunities. Heavy taxation was a constant, and the local economy had to adapt to the demands of the empire. Agricultural production, olives, wine, and grain, was directed toward supplying Roman markets. Merchants, however, benefited from the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which ensured safe sea routes and expanded trade networks. Cities prospered if they aligned themselves with Rome's interests. Wealthy Greek elites often acted as intermediaries between their communities and Roman authorities, securing privileges in exchange for loyalty. These elites adopted Roman dress and customs in public life, while maintaining Greek traditions at home. Religious and cultural exchange. The religious life of Greece under Rome was a tapestry woven from old and new threads. The ancient Olympian gods remained central to public festivals and rituals, but the Roman pantheon merged seamlessly with Greek deities, Jupiter with Zeus, Venus with Aphrodite, Mars with Ares. The imperial cult, worshipping the emperor as a divine figure. spread across the Greek world, often housed in temples alongside traditional gods. Mystery religions, such as the cults of Dionysus and Demeter, flourished, attracting followers seeking personal salvation and a deeper spiritual connection. Eastern religions, including the worship of Isis from Egypt and Mithras from Persia, found a place in Greek cities, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of the empire. The Greek intellectual influence on Rome, perhaps the most enduring aspect of Greek life under Roman rule, was its intellectual legacy. Greek historians like Plutarch chronicled the lives of both Greek and Roman figures, weaving the histories of the two civilizations together. Philosophers such as Epictetus, born a slave in Phrygia, taught Stoicism in Greek, influencing Roman thought at the highest levels. Science and medicine continued to advance. Galen, the Greek physician whose work would dominate medical knowledge for over a millennium, practiced in Rome but wrote in Greek. The lingua franca of the Eastern Empire remained Greek, even in official administration, underscoring its dominance in intellectual and cultural life. The seeds of change by the 3rd century CE, cracks began to appear in Rome's control. Economic troubles, political instability, and external threats strained the empire. In the east, Greek-speaking provinces became increasingly important to the empire's survival. This shift culminated in the 4th century CE, when Constantine the Great founded a new capital at Byzantium, renamed Constantinople, signaling the ascendancy of the Greek-speaking eastern half of the empire. In time, this Eastern Roman Empire, later called the Byzantine Empire, would carry forward Greek culture, language, and traditions long after the fall of Rome in the West. The Greeks, though conquered, had outlasted their conquerors in a way that no one could have predicted during the dark days after Corinth's fall. A subjugated yet triumphant people, Greece under Roman rule was a paradox. It had lost the independence that had defined the city-states for centuries, yet it retained and even expanded its cultural influence. The philosophers of Athens, the scholars of Alexandria, and the artists of the Aegean shaped the minds and tastes of their Roman masters. In the end, Greece did not merely survive Roman rule, it transformed it. The political institutions of the polis faded, but the ideals, art, and intellect of Greece endured, reshaping the identity of the empire itself. When the torch of power eventually passed from Rome to Byzantium, it was a Greek flame that lit the way. By the early 4th century CE, the Roman Empire stood at a turning point. For centuries, the political center of power had been Rome, but the lifeblood of the empire, its wealth, manpower, and cultural vitality, increasingly flowed from the eastern provinces. The Greek-speaking lands of the Aegean, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt had become Rome's richest territories, supplying grain, trade goods, and tax revenues that the West could no longer match. It was here, in the East, that a new capital would rise, a city destined to become the beating heart of a Greek-speaking empire for more than 1,000 years. Constantine's vision. In 324 CE, Constantine the Great, having defeated his rivals and become sole ruler of the empire, sought a new seat of power. Rome, ancient and prestigious, was geographically ill-suited to govern an empire that now stretched deep into the east. The western provinces were declining, beset by invasions and economic weakness. The east, by contrast, was vibrant, wealthy, and strategically positioned between Europe and Asia. Constantine chose the site of Byzantium, a modest Greek city on the Bosporus, as the foundation for his new capital. Its location was perfect. It commanded the narrow strait linking the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, controlled trade routes between continents, and was easily defended by water on 3 sides. In 330 CE, the city was formally dedicated as Nova Roma, New Rome, though it quickly became known by the name that would endure, Constantinople, a Greek city in Roman garb. While Constantine's city was built as a Roman imperial capital, its language, culture, and soul were unmistakably Greek. The people of Constantinople spoke Greek in the streets, worshipped in churches that blended Roman grandeur with Hellenic artistry, and inherited the traditions of the classical world. The city's design reflected its dual heritage. Roman forums and triumphal arches stood alongside colonnaded streets and public squares in the Greek style. The Hippodrome, modeled after the Circus Maximus, became the city's arena for chariot races, events that were as much about politics as sport. Markets brimmed with goods from across the Mediterranean and beyond, silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, olive oil and wine from the Aegean. The eastern shift, Constantinople's rise, marked a decisive shift in the balance of the empire. While the western half continued to face invasions from Germanic tribes and economic decline, the east prospered under strong trade networks and a stable currency. The Greek-speaking elite of the eastern provinces filled imperial offices, staffed the military, and shaped policy. This cultural dominance was reinforced by the spread of Christianity, which Constantine legalized and promoted. The theological debates that would define early Christianity, from the nature of Christ to the authority of the Church, were conducted largely in Greek, not Latin. The great councils of the Church, such as Nicaea in 325 CE, were held in the eastern provinces and attended by Greek bishops. The fall of the West. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Western Roman Empire was in steep decline. Repeated barbarian invasions, internal political chaos, and economic collapse culminated in the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 CE, and again by the Vandals in 455 CE. In 476 CE, the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed, an event later historians marked as the fall of the Roman Empire. Yet in the east, the empire lived on. Constantinople, protected by its massive Theodosian walls, repelled wave after wave of attacks. Its harbors remained busy, its treasury full, its culture vibrant. While the West lay in ruins, the Eastern Empire, now ruled almost entirely by Greek-speaking elites, became the true heir of Rome. The Byzantine identity. Over time, the Eastern Empire evolved into what historians now call the Byzantine Empire, though its citizens saw themselves simply as Romans. Romeo in Greek. Latin, once the language of government, gave way to Greek in administration, law, and literature. The Orthodox Christian faith, deeply rooted in Greek theological thought, became the unifying force of the state. Art and architecture reflected this synthesis of Roman authority and Greek heritage. The Hagia Sophia, built under Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century, was a marvel of engineering and beauty, its massive dome seeming to float on light, adorned with mosaics in the Greek style. The empire's legal foundation, the Corpus Juris, Civilis, drew from Roman law, but was codified in Greek for everyday use. Greece, in the Byzantine world, in this new order, the Greek mainland and islands remained vital provinces. Cities like Thessaloniki, Corinth, and Athens continued as centers of trade, learning, and religion. Monasteries on Mount Athos became spiritual and scholarly hubs, preserving classical Greek manuscripts and producing theological works that would shape Orthodox Christianity. While political power was concentrated in Constantinople, Greek identity flourished throughout the empire. The language of Homer and Plato was not only preserved but adapted, serving as the medium for diplomacy, science, theology, and literature. The Byzantines saw themselves as the living continuation of both the Roman state and the Hellenic tradition. A legacy. The rise of Byzantium ensured that Greek civilization did not fade with the loss of the polis or the fall of classical city-states. Instead, it transformed, finding new life in an empire that straddled 2 continents and 1,000 years of history. In Constantinople, the ideals of the ancient Greek world, civic pride, intellectual pursuit, artistic excellence, were reborn in Christian form. The empire's survival through the medieval centuries would allow Greece's cultural legacy to pass through the crucible of time, ready to inspire the Renaissance and beyond. By the 6th century CE, the Eastern Roman Empire, now unmistakably Greek in language and spirit, had reached the height of its power. This was the Byzantine zenith, an era when Constantinople stood as the unrivaled jewel of the Mediterranean, a city whose walls had never been breached, whose markets overflowed with riches from 3 continents, and whose scholars preserved and expanded upon the intellectual inheritance of the ancient world. At the center of this golden age stood Justinian, the first reigned 527 to 565 CE, a man of relentless ambition and vision. His reign would be remembered for its dazzling achievements, its monumental building projects, and its attempts to restore the old Roman world, as well as for the strains those ambitions placed on the empire. Justinian's vision. Justinian saw himself not as a mere caretaker of the empire, but as a restorer, the emperor who would reunite the lost provinces of the West under Constantinople as authority. He believed the empire's glory lay in its Roman heritage, yet his court and bureaucracy operated entirely in Greek. His laws, edicts, and religious policies were drafted in the language of Homer, even as they claimed the legacy of Augustus. Alongside him was Empress Theodora, one of the most remarkable women in Byzantine history. Rising from humble and controversial beginnings as an actress, Theodora became Justinian's most trusted advisor, renowned for her intelligence, political shrewdness, and unshakable resolve. The reconquest Justinian's armies, led by brilliant generals such as Belisarius and Narses, embarked on campaigns to reclaim the western territories lost to barbarian kingdoms. In North Africa, 533 to 534 CE, the Vandal kingdom was crushed, restoring the rich grainlands of the province to imperial control. In Italy, Belisarius waged the Gothic War 535 to 554 CE, defeating the Ostrogoths and bringing Rome, Ravenna, and much of the peninsula back into the empire, though at terrible cost in lives and resources. In Spain, Byzantine forces seized parts of the southern coast from the Visigoths. For a brief moment, the Mediterranean once again seemed like Mare Nostrum, our sea, as it had been in the days of the Roman Empire. But the reconquests stretched the empire's treasury thin, and holding these distant lands proved far harder than winning them. The Nika Revolt. While Justinian expanded abroad, trouble brewed at home. In 532 CE, Constantinople erupted in the Nika Revolt, a violent uprising sparked by factional disputes in the Hippodrome, but fueled by widespread resentment over taxes and autocratic rule. The riots escalated into a full-scale rebellion, with much of the city set ablaze. At the height of the crisis, Justinian considered fleeing, but Theodora refused. In a speech that became legendary, she declared, "Purple is the noblest shroud," meaning she would rather die as an empress than live in exile. Her resolve stiffened Justinian's will. Imperial forces, led by Belisarius, slaughtered thousands of rebels in the Hippodrome, crushing the revolt and preserving Justinian's reign. The Hagia Sophia. In the aftermath of the revolt, Justinian embarked on the most ambitious building project of his era, the reconstruction of the Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom. Completed in just 5 years, the new basilica was a marvel of engineering and beauty, with a vast dome that seemed to float on light pouring through its ring of windows. Inside, shimmering gold mosaics reflected candlelight, creating an otherworldly glow. The Hagia Sophia was more than a church. It was a statement of imperial power, divine favor, and the fusion of Roman authority with Greek artistry. For nearly 1,000 years, it would be the largest cathedral in the Christian world. Codifying the law, Justinian also undertook the monumental task of reforming and codifying Roman law. The result, the Corpus Juris Civilis, body of civil law, preserved centuries of legal thought and practice, organizing it into a coherent system, written in Latin for legal precision, but studied and applied in Greek throughout the empire. This code became the foundation of Byzantine law and would later influence legal systems across Europe. Religion and controversy. A devout and sometimes uncompromising Christian, Justinian sought to unify the empire under a single orthodoxy. He involved himself deeply in theological disputes, convening councils and issuing edicts to suppress what he deemed heresies. His religious policies sometimes alienated groups within the empire, particularly in Egypt and Syria, where Monophysitism had strong support. The emperor also strengthened ties between church and state, reinforcing the idea that the ruler was God's representative on earth, a belief that would shape Byzantine political culture for centuries. Challenges on the frontiers. Even at the height of his reign, Justinian faced formidable challenges. In the east, the Persian Sassanid Empire remained a constant rival, requiring costly defenses and occasional truces. In the Balkans, Slavic tribes began pressing into imperial territory, and in 541 CE, the empire was struck by the plague of Justinian, a devastating pandemic that killed tens of thousands in Constantinople alone and weakened the empire's manpower and economy. The legacy of the zenith. When Justinian died in 565 CE, the empire he left was both magnificent and strained. His reconquests had restored a semblance of the old Roman world, but they had also overextended the empire's resources. The Hagia Sophia, the Corpus Juris Civilis, and the memory of his bold ambition remained enduring symbols of Byzantine greatness. For Greece itself, the Byzantine zenith meant continued integration into an empire that saw itself as the guardian of Hellenic heritage. Greek language, education, and artistic traditions flourished under imperial patronage. The spirit of Athens, the skill of the sculptors of antiquity, and the scholarship of Alexandria all found new life in this Christian empire. But history would not allow Byzantium to rest on its laurels. New threats were rising, from the east, from the north, and from the deserts of Arabia, that would test the empire's strength as never before. The reign of Justinian had marked the pinnacle of Byzantine and thus Greek power in the medieval world. But as the centuries passed, the empire faced an unrelenting series of challenges. From its zenith in the 6th century to its fall in the 15th, Byzantium would be transformed again and again, its borders shrinking, its politics evolving, and its identity adapting to survive. In the end, Greek civilization endured, but the city at its heart, Constantinople, would meet a fate both tragic and legendary. Storm from the desert in the 7th century. A new force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula, the armies of Islam, united under the banner of the Prophet Muhammad. The Arabs swept through the Middle East with astonishing speed. Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, some of the empire's richest provinces, fell within a generation. The loss of Egypt's grain and Alexandria's intellectual wealth was a devastating blow. The Byzantines, however, proved resilient. Under emperors like Heraclius, they reorganized the empire's administration into themes, military districts that combined civil and military authority. The Greek language, already dominant, became the sole official language of administration, marking a definitive shift from the Latin heritage of Rome. Defenders of the city Constantinople itself faced repeated sieges. The most dramatic came in 717 to 718 CE, when the Arab Caliphate launched a massive assault. The city's formidable Theodosian walls, and the use of Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon that could burn even on water, turned the tide. The defenders repelled the invaders, securing the empire's survival for centuries. These victories preserved not only the empire, but also the Christian Greek culture of the Eastern Mediterranean. Without them, the history of Europe and the Near East might have been profoundly different. The Macedonian Renaissance from the 9th to the 11th centuries. The empire experienced a revival under the Macedonian dynasty. This period saw territorial expansion into the Balkans, Armenia, and parts of Syria. Trade flourished, art and literature revived, and Greek scholarship reached new heights. The Church of Hagia Sophia was adorned with magnificent new mosaics. Monasteries on Mount Athos became centers of learning and spirituality, and scholars preserved and copied the works of classical Greek authors. It was during this time that Byzantine diplomacy, rather than military conquest, became one of its greatest strengths, playing neighboring powers against each other to preserve the empire's position. The Crusader catastrophe. The empire's fortunes changed abruptly in the late 11th century. The Seljuk Turks defeated the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert, 1071 CE, opening much of Anatolia to Turkish settlement. In desperation, the Byzantines appealed to the West for aid, sparking the First Crusade. Initially, the Crusaders were allies, helping Byzantium recover some lost territories, but mistrust simmered between the Latin West and the Greek East. This tension exploded in 1204, when the Fourth Crusade, diverted from its mission to the Holy Land, sacked Constantinople. The city was looted, treasures were stolen, and priceless relics were carried off to Venice and other Western cities. The Byzantine Empire was carved into feudal states under Latin control. Though the Greeks recaptured Constantinople in 1261, the empire never fully recovered. Its territory was reduced, its wealth diminished, and its population drained. The Ottoman threat in the 14th and 15th centuries. A new power rose in Anatolia, the Ottoman Turks. Step by step, they absorbed former Byzantine lands, pressing ever closer to Constantinople. The empire, now little more than the city and a few outlying territories, sought aid from the West. But centuries of religious schism between the Orthodox East and Catholic West hindered unity. Efforts at church reunion to secure military help, such as the Union of Florence in 1439, were deeply unpopular among the Greek populace, who saw them as compromising their faith. The aid that did come was too little, too late. The final siege in 1453, Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottomans launched his final assault on Constantinople. The city's defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, numbered only around 7,000 against an Ottoman force of perhaps 80,000, armed with massive cannons capable of battering the ancient walls. For weeks, the city held. The defenders repelled assault after assault, fighting with the same spirit that had resisted Persians, Arabs, and Crusaders. But on May 29th, after a relentless bombardment and a breach in the walls, the Ottomans poured into the city. Constantine XI is said to have cast aside his imperial regalia and fought to the death in the streets. The end and the beginning. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and the last political embodiment of the ancient Greek world. The Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. The city became Istanbul, and the Ottoman Empire replaced Byzantium as the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet in another sense, Greek civilization did not die. Greek scholars fled west, carrying manuscripts and knowledge that would fuel the European Renaissance. The Orthodox Church, centered in Greece and other former Byzantine lands, preserved religious traditions and a distinct Greek identity under Ottoman rule. The language of Plato and Homer continued to be spoken, the heritage of the ancients surviving in monasteries, villages, and the hearts of the Greek people. Legacy of 1,000 years from the city-states of classical Greece to the Empire of Alexander, from the brilliance of the Hellenistic world to the glory of Byzantium. Greek civilization had shown a unique capacity to adapt, endure, and transform. Even in defeat, it shaped the world around it. The fall of Constantinople was a tragedy for those who called themselves Romai, Romans in name, Greeks in culture, but it was also the spark that spread Greek learning to new lands. In this way, the light of Hellas, though dimmed, was never extinguished. It burned on in the minds of scholars, the domes of churches, the rhythms of language, and the dreams of a future Greece yet to be reborn.